Ever been walking in the woods and just felt it? That sensation of eyes on you, a presence you just couldn't shake, couldn't explain? What if that watcher wasn't just some ordinary animal, but something far older and a whole lot more sinister? They say some woods are like gateways, and certain creatures can slip into any skin they choose. Tonight, we're not talking about bears or wolves. Oh no, we're talking about the Unsolved. Deep inside the vast, shadowy corners of America's oldest forests, ancient fears can feel terrifyingly real. These aren't your friendly neighborhood woods, the ones for leisurely hikes and pretty campsites. We're talking about the lost woods, places where the curtain between our world and, well, something else is unsettlingly thin. Tonight, we're exploring some truly chilling stories from people who ventured too deep, who heard their names called by voices that shouldn't exist, and who came face to face with an entity spoken of only in hushed, terrified whispers, the Skinwalker. Now, if you haven't heard of it, the Skinwalker comes from Navajo folklore. It's said to be a being of immense power, a malevolent witch who can transform, taking the shape of animals or even other people. These aren't just misunderstood creatures. They're often described as beings of pure evil, having gained their unnatural powers through the most awful acts, often involving betraying their own. For many, these entities aren't just myths to be brushed aside. They're a frightening reality, a predator that might walk on 2 legs or 4, a master of imitation, and a bringer of terrible luck. The stories you're about to hear, they're not for the faint of heart. They come from those who stared into the eyes of the unnatural and were never quite the same. These are America's most haunted lost woods, and these are their real Skinwalker horror stories. The New Mexico wilderness. It's a place of stark, rugged beauty and a silence that can feel absolute. For centuries, the Gila National Forest has been a haven for wildlife, its sheer size swallowing roads and trails, leaving much of its heart untouched. It was here, near a spot old maps called Apache Creek, that Marcus and his 2 friends, Liam and Chloe, decided to spend a week backpacking. They were aiming to get far, far away from cell signals and city noise. Marcus, a keen outdoorsman, had heard the local tales, of course, whispers about strange things happening in the deeper parts of the Gila. But he'd always shrugged them off as just campfire stories, something to spook the tourists. He was about to find out how wrong he was. Their first couple of days? Absolutely perfect. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and their own happy chatter. They'd set up camp each night, cook over a small fire, and share stories under a sky so packed with stars it felt like you could just reach out and grab a handful. It was on the 3rd night that things started to shift. They'd made camp in a little clearing surrounded by a dense thicket of towering ponderosa pines. As dusk began to settle, a weird stillness fell over the woods. That usual nighttime choir of crickets and distant coyotes? Silent. Liam, who was always ready with a joke, even mentioned it. Guess the woods are holding their breath tonight, huh? Marcus felt that little prickle of unease, that gut feeling he couldn't quite name. He scanned the tree line, the shadows growing deeper as the last bit of light drained from the sky. He didn't see anything, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Chloe, who usually wasn't fazed by much, seemed jumpy, constantly glancing over her shoulder. Later, as they sat around the fire, a sound cut through the silence. It was a low whistle, almost like a melody, but off somehow. It seemed to echo from different directions all at once. What was that? Chloe whispered, her eyes wide. Probably just the wind in the trees, Marcus said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. His own heart had definitely picked up the pace. The whistling came again, closer this time. It was definitely not the wind. It sounded almost like someone trying to mimic a bird call, but getting it wrong. The notes just a bit jarring, unnatural. Liam, ever the practical one, grabbed a powerful flashlight and aimed it towards the trees. "Hello," he called out. "Anyone out there?" Only silence answered, a heavy, waiting kind of silence. Marcus tossed more wood on the fire, making the flames jump higher, pushing back the creeping darkness. He found himself remembering stories from his Navajo grandmother, tales he'd mostly forgotten or dismissed. Stories of the Unsolved, who could mimic sounds to lure you in, who moved with eerie speed and silence. He tried to push the thoughts away. This was 2025, not some ancient myth. Then, a soft tapping started on the side of their tent, the one furthest from the fire. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate. All three of them froze. "Okay, that's not funny," Liam said, his voice tight. He clearly thought one of the others was messing with him, but Marcus and Chloe were right there by the fire. Marcus grabbed his own flashlight, his hand surprisingly steady. "Stay here," he muttered, and slowly walked towards the tent. He circled it, his light slicing through the dark. Nothing. No footprints in the soft pine needles, no broken branches. Absolutely nothing. He came back to the fire, the unease now a cold knot in his stomach. There's nothing there. No sooner had the words left his mouth than a blood-curdling scream tore through the night. It sounded like a woman, absolutely terrified, and it came from deep in the woods, right in the direction they'd planned to hike the next day. "Oh my God, someone's hurt," Chloe cried, jumping to her feet. "Wait," Marcus said, grabbing her arm. "Don't. That didn't sound right." The scream came again, but this time, it was subtly different. Still a woman's scream, but it was as if the first one was a recording, and this was a slightly warped playback. And then, even more terrifyingly, it began to change. The scream turned into a coyote's howl, then the guttural snarl of a cougar, then a laugh. A low, chuckling laugh that seemed to be mocking their fear. Panic hit them. Liam was white as a ghost. "What is that? What the hell is that?" Marcus was thinking of those legends again. The shapeshifters, the deceivers. "We need to pack up. Now. We're leaving." They scrambled to douse the fire and shove their gear into their packs, hands shaking so badly they could barely work the buckles. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe with unseen movement. The forest, which had felt so beautiful just hours before, now felt suffocating, hostile. As they fumbled with the last of their things, a new sound started, closer this time, right at the edge of the clearing. It was the sound of something heavy, dragging itself through the undergrowth. Then they saw it. At first, Marcus thought it was a large deer, its silhouette stark against the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. But as it moved further into the dim light from their headlamps, he realized how incredibly wrong he was. It was on 4 legs, but its proportions were all off. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a badly handled puppet. Its fur, or what looked like fur, was matted and dark, almost black. And its eyes glowed with a faint, sickly yellow light. It stopped at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away, and then slowly, impossibly, it began to rise onto its hind legs. It stood there, impossibly tall, its form vaguely human-like but grotesquely twisted. Its head, too large for its body, tilted to one side, as if it was looking them over with a cold, alien intelligence. It made no sound, but Marcus felt a wave of pure, undiluted terror wash over him, so strong it almost paralyzed him. This was no animal. This was something ancient, something evil. Chloe let out a choked sob. Liam stood frozen, his flashlight beam shaking violently on the creature. The Skinwalker took a step towards them, its movements still jerky, yet disturbingly fast. That snapped them out of it. "Run!" Marcus screamed, shoving Chloe and Liam ahead of him. They fled, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces, their lungs burning. They didn't dare look back. Behind them, they could hear it, a swift, heavy padding that seemed to keep pace with them easily, sometimes sounding like it was on 4 legs, sometimes on 2. And that laughter, that horrible, mocking laughter, echoed through the trees. They ran for what felt like forever, fueled by adrenaline and raw fear. They lost the trail, stumbled through creeks, and scrambled over fallen logs, the sounds of their pursuer always just behind them, a relentless, terrifying presence. At one point, Liam tripped, and Marcus hauled him back to his feet, a guttural snarl seeming to erupt from just yards away. Finally, as the very first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they stumbled onto a dirt logging road. They were sobbing, exhausted, and covered in scratches, but they didn't stop. They ran down that road for another mile until, thankfully, they saw the distant lights of a farmhouse. They burst into the farmer's yard, babbling about what they'd seen. The old man, weathered and calm, listened patiently. When they were done, he simply nodded. "You folks were lucky," he said, his voice grave. "You were in their territory. Some things in these woods, they're best left alone. You encountered what my people call a ye nald lushii. He told them they weren't the first to have such an encounter in those woods, and that many who did were never seen again. Marcus, Liam, and Chloe never went backpacking again. The whispering pines of Apache Creek were no longer a place of beauty for them. Instead, they were a chilling reminder of the night they came face to face with something that defied all explanation, something that hunted them through the darkness. Its yellow eyes and mocking laughter burned into their memories forever. The woods, Marcus learned, held secrets far older and more terrifying than he could have ever dreamed. The deep woods of the American Southwest aren't the only places where these things are said to roam. Sometimes the most terrifying encounters happen a bit closer to home in those spots where the wild still stubbornly pushes up against the edges of our towns and cities. A stark reminder that not all monsters stick to the deepest wilderness. Sarah and her husband, Tom, lived in a nice, modest house right on the edge of a sprawling state park in southern Ohio. Their property backed directly onto acres of dense, old-growth forest, a place of rugged hills and deep ravines. They loved the quiet, the feeling of being so close to nature. Their nearest neighbors were almost a mile down a winding country road. For years, their life was peaceful, just the rhythm of the changing seasons and the quiet hum of the wilderness. That peace was absolutely shattered one cold autumn night. It started small. Their dog, Gus, a normally happy-go-lucky golden retriever, began acting weird. He'd stand at the back door, whining, the fur on his back raised, just staring intently into the dark woods. Sometimes he'd let out these low, guttural growls, sounds Sarah had never heard him make. Tom would go out with a flashlight, expecting to see a raccoon or a deer, but there was never anything there. "Probably just smelling a fox, old boy," he'd say, ruffling Gus's fur. But Sarah noticed the dog wouldn't settle down easily on those nights. A few weeks later, the noises began. Late at night, usually after they'd gone to bed, they'd hear scratching sounds on the outside walls of the house. It sounded like branches scraping the siding, except there were no low-hanging branches near those walls. Then came the tapping, soft at first, then more insistent, on their bedroom window, which was on the second floor. Sarah would sit bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding. Tom, a practical guy, would grumble about squirrels or birds, but the regularity and the very specific nature of the sounds unnerved them both. One evening, Sarah was in the kitchen washing dishes, looking out the window at the woods as they darkened. Gus was asleep in his bed by the fireplace. Suddenly, she saw movement at the tree line, a flicker of something dark. She squinted, trying to make it out. It was too big to be a deer, and it moved with this odd, loping gait. She watched as it just melted back into the shadows. It was just a fleeting glimpse, but it left her with a deep sense of unease. She told Tom about it, but he brushed it off. Probably just a big coyote, hon. Lots of 'em around here. The following Saturday, Tom had to go into town for a late meeting, leaving Sarah alone. Gus was especially agitated that evening, pacing restlessly and whining at the back door. Sarah tried to calm him, but he stayed on edge. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in from the woods, blanketing their yard in an eerie silence. The scratching sounds started earlier than usual, more aggressive this time, on the back wall of the house, near the kitchen. Sarah locked all the doors and windows, her anxiety growing by the minute. She tried to read a book but couldn't focus. Gus suddenly leaped to his feet, barking furiously at the back door. The scratching stopped. Then, a heavy thud, as if something large had thrown itself against the door. Gus went into a frenzy, snarling and snapping. Sarah grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, her hands trembling. "Who's there?" she yelled, her voice shaking. Silence. Then, a soft, almost childlike whimper came from the other side of the door. "Help me, please." Sarah froze. It sounded like a little girl. But what on earth would a child be doing out here, in the woods, in this fog, at this hour? "Help. I'm lost." The voice pleaded again, closer to the door now. Gus was still barking, but there was a hint of confusion in his barks. Sarah felt a surge of maternal instinct. What if it really was a child? She crept towards the door, poker held high. "Who are you? Where are your parents?" "Cold, so cold." The voice whispered, and then it coughed, a wet, rasping sound. Sarah's hand reached for the deadbolt. Just as her fingers brushed the cold metal, Gus let out a terrifying, high-pitched yelp and launched himself at the door, not aggressively, but as if trying to block her from it. Startled, Sarah pulled her hand back, and in that single instant, the voice outside changed. The whimpering stopped. The soft, childlike tone vanished, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle. It was a sound so filled with malice, so utterly unnatural, that it chilled Sarah right to the bone. Almost. The voice rasped, no longer sounding like a child, but like something ancient and cruel. So close. Then, something slammed against the door with incredible force, making the wood shudder in its frame. Gus howled. Sarah screamed and stumbled back, the poker clattering to the floor. She could hear it outside, circling the house, its heavy footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. It was testing the windows, rattling the frames. She ran to the phone and dialed 911, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. As she spoke to the dispatcher, her voice choked with terror. She heard a new sound, claws, long and sharp, dragging down the glass of the living room window. She huddled in the corner of the living room with Gus, who was now pressed against her, trembling violently. The sounds continued for what felt like an eternity. The scraping, the heavy thuds, the occasional low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the house. Then, just as suddenly as they began, they stopped. The police arrived 20 minutes later, their flashing lights cutting through the fog. They found nothing. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, nothing to explain the terror Sarah had gone through. They were polite but skeptical, suggesting a large animal, maybe a bear, disoriented by the fog. But Sarah knew what she'd heard. She knew that voice, the way it had shifted, the pure evil in that chuckle. Tom, when he got back and heard her story, was deeply shaken. He installed security cameras and floodlights the very next day. The cameras caught nothing for a week. Then, one morning, while reviewing the overnight footage, Tom called Sarah over, his face pale. The camera overlooking the back deck had caught something. Around 3 a.m., in the grainy night vision, a figure could be seen emerging from the woods. It was tall and gaunt, moving with an unnerving, jerky motion. It approached the house, its limbs seeming too long, its proportions subtly wrong. As it neared the camera, it looked up, and for one horrifying second, its eyes seemed to glow in the infrared light, like an animal's, but with an intelligence that was chillingly human. It reached out a long, spindly hand towards the camera, and then the footage cut out, just static filling the screen for the next hour. They never saw the figure again, but the fear never really left them. They sold the house a few months later, unable to shake the feeling of being watched, of that malevolent presence just beyond the tree line. Sarah often thought about that voice, the childlike plea that had almost tricked her. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that if Gus hadn't intervened, if she had opened that door, she would have come face to face with the thing that stalked the Ohio Valley, the thing with glowing eyes and a voice that could mimic innocence to hide an ancient evil. The woods, she realized, weren't just a place of beauty. They were a hiding place for things that preyed on the unsuspecting. These encounters are a pretty stark reminder that there are things out there, in those dark woods, that just defy easy explanation, don't they? If these stories are sending a few shivers down your spine, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more tales from the edge of what we know. And hey, if you've had your own unsettling experience in the woods, please share it in the comments below. You're definitely not alone. Now, let's head back into the shadows. The desert landscapes of Utah, especially those vast and desolate regions bordering tribal lands, have long been linked with stories of the Skinwalker. Places like Skinwalker Ranch are notorious, but the tales aren't just confined to one spot. They seep out from the canyons and across the dry plains, whispered by locals and, unfortunately, experienced by unlucky travelers. This story comes from David, a geologist who spent a summer surveying a remote area in the Uinta Basin, not far from lands historically tied to both Ute and Navajo peoples. David was a man of science, a skeptic by nature and his job. He'd heard the rumors, sure. The talk of shapeshifters, strange lights, weird livestock mutilations. He dismissed them all as folklore. Fascinating, yeah, but ultimately just stories. His job was to map rock formations, to understand the earth, not to go chasing phantoms. He often worked alone, driving his rugged Jeep miles from the nearest paved road, then hiking even further into the backcountry. One late afternoon, as the sun began to sink below the crimson mesas, casting long, eerie shadows, David was packing up his gear. He was in a particularly isolated stretch of Badlands, a maze of dry washes and weathered sandstone. He'd been feeling on edge all day, that persistent feeling of being watched that he just couldn't shake. He kept telling himself it was the solitude, the sheer emptiness of the landscape getting to him. As he loaded the last of his equipment into the Jeep, he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the distinct bleating of a sheep, sounding like it was in distress, coming from a nearby ravine. That was odd. He hadn't seen any livestock or any signs of grazing for miles. The sound was mournful, almost desperate. Curiosity, and maybe a bit of concern, got the better of him. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, even though it was still twilight, and headed towards the sound, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there? Is your animal hurt?" The bleating continued, leading him deeper into the narrow, winding ravine. The rock walls rose high on either side, and the light began to fade quickly in their shadow. He used his flashlight beam to navigate, the sound of the distressed sheep always just a little further ahead. "Come on, little guy. Where are you?" he muttered, starting to feel a bit foolish. Then the bleeding stopped, just like that. Abruptly, an unnerving silence fell, broken only by the crunch of his own boots on the loose gravel. "Hello," he called again, his voice sounding way too loud in the sudden quiet. He rounded a bend in the ravine, and his flashlight beam fell on something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a sheep. Standing there, not 20 feet away, was a coyote, but it was unlike any coyote he had ever seen or even read about. It was enormous, far larger than normal, its fur mangy and dark, almost black in the dim light. Its eyes, reflecting his flashlight beam, glowed with an eerie, intelligent green, and it was standing on its hind legs, its front paws held strangely at its chest. David's breath hitched. This wasn't right. Coyotes don't stand like that. They don't look like that. The creature let out a low growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate right in David's chest. Then, horrifyingly, it spoke. Or rather, it mimicked a sound he'd heard just moments before. A perfect, mournful bleat of a sheep. David stumbled back, his mind racing, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing and hearing. The legends he'd brushed off so easily came flooding back. The Yenald Lushii, the shapeshifter, the imitator. The coyote thing took a step towards him, its movements fluid and predatory. It was still on two legs, its form seeming to subtly shift, to stretch, becoming something horribly in between. Its lips, if you could even call them that, curled back to show teeth that were far too long, far too sharp. David did the only thing he could think of. He turned and ran. He scrambled back up the ravine, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sound of something swift and heavy-footed chasing him. He didn't dare look back. He could hear its breathing, a ragged, guttural sound, broken up by occasional soft, mocking bleats. He burst out of the ravine and sprinted towards his Jeep, fumbling for his keys with shaking hands. He could hear it gaining on him. He reached the Jeep, yanked the door open, and threw himself inside, slamming the door shut and desperately turning the ignition. The engine roared to life just as a heavy thud slammed against the driver's side door. He didn't look. He slammed the Jeep into gear and sped away, fishtailing on the loose dirt, bouncing wildly over the rough terrain. In his rearview mirror, for one terrifying instant, he saw it. The creature was standing at the edge of the ravine, bathed in the red glow of his taillights. It was no longer a coyote. It was taller now, gaunt and shadowy, its form unclear but unmistakably humanoid, just watching him go. David drove like a man possessed, not stopping until he reached the small, dusty town where he was staying. He burst into the local diner, pale and shaking, and told his story to a couple of old-timers who were nursing coffees. They listened, their faces grim. One of them, a Navajo man with eyes that seemed to hold an ancient wisdom, nodded slowly when David finished. "You were lucky," he said, his voice low. "You trespassed, and it showed itself to you. It was toying with you, leading you with a borrowed voice. These things, they can wear many faces, many skins. They are deceivers. What you saw, it has many names, but it is always evil." David cut his surveying trip short. He left Utah the next day and never went back to the Uinta Basin. The world of precise measurements and geological certainties he had once known now felt fragile, thin. He had seen something that ripped a hole in his understanding of reality, something that looked back at him from the darkness with intelligent, malevolent eyes, and spoke with the voice of an innocent animal. The desolate beauty of the Badlands was forever spoiled by the memory of that encounter, a chilling reminder that some legends are much more than just stories, and some creatures do indeed walk in borrowed forms. The power of these entities, as you can hear in these chilling tales, isn't just in their ability to scare us. It's in their sneaky way of chipping away at our sense of safety, of turning a familiar rustle of leaves or an animal's call into a sign of something deeply unnatural and hostile. For those who've had such encounters, the woods are never quite the same. The forests of America are vast, and their deepest corners still hide mysteries that our modern world struggles to explain. The legends of the Skinwalker born from ancient Navajo traditions speak of a terror that's both primal and deeply unsettling. That fear of the known becoming unknown, of a familiar face or shape masking an unspeakable evil. Whether these encounters are literal run-ins with shape-shifting beings or something else, something inexplicable, the fear they cause is undeniably real. These stories are just a few threads in a much larger, darker tapestry of folklore and alleged true encounters that stretch all across the American wilderness. They remind us that maybe, just maybe, we're not always at the top of the food chain when we step into those shadowed places. They whisper that some legends have teeth, and some parts of the world are best left completely undisturbed. So, the next time you find yourself alone in the woods, as the light begins to fade and the trees cast long, dancing shadows, listen closely. Listen for the sounds that are just a little off, for that watcher you can't quite see. And remember these stories. Thank you for joining us in the Lost Woods tonight. If these accounts have chilled you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing for more explorations into the unexplained. Don't forget to share your own eerie encounters or thoughts in the comments below. We do read them all. Until next time, stay safe, and perhaps stay out of the woods after dark.